WNST. Tabs have played at home on Preak this weekend. Not this weekend. They are headed off to Boston and Fenway Park after a really, really strange week with 4 days of traffic, 2 days of scheduled baseball, and one weirdly moved almost into the morning afternoon of baseball where things did not go well on Wednesday afternoon at Oriole Park at Camden Yards as they take off for Boston. Luke, the weirdest thing is just the pitching and the rest and the rain and the Fenway, and here we go. But they have not played a lot of baseball this week. It was almost like an all-star game week or something, right?
Yeah, it's really been a weird week in that regard, and the strange thing is this was actually a team that was starting to play some decent baseball. I mean, they had a 5-3 homestand, and look, when you bury yourself over the first 6 weeks of the season, you know that you have, if you're going to do anything to move the meter, it's got to be dramatic. 5-3 is not doing that, but it still represented their best 8-game stretch of the season. So, you have this weird week. You think Miguel Castro is going to make a start. You're wondering when David Hess is going to make his next start. Andrew Kastner gets pushed back. And now you go into Fenway for a 4-game set where you're making up a game. And you're still wondering who's going to start Sunday. So Wednesday was weird. They moved the game up half an hour. They played in a light rain that wasn't miserable completely, but still was far from ideal.
It didn't look comfortable. I mean, I'll be honest. But it looked cold, but it wasn't cold. So, I mean, there's one thing about a 70-degree rain. It's a little different than a 40-degree rain. But, they had to get it in. I mean, this is where we are with the Preakness this week, right? I mean, it's just wet all week. They're lucky they didn't have 4 games scheduled this week, right?
Yeah, they were definitely lucky in that regard. And as poorly as they handled Tuesday night, which was just completely ridiculous.
Is there anything they do well? I woke up on Thursday morning and Chris Pica had shared a Baseball America piece about what a disgrace their international scouting is. I mean, obviously I had Nick Cafardo on. You can go check that out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. He wrote a takedown of them on Sunday, clearly because he's known Dan Duquette for 35 years. All that information came from him. And that's obvious. I don't... What do they do well these days? I mean, literally, they can't handle a freaking rainout, an obvious rainout on a Tuesday night. It's disgraceful.
Well, and here's where I'll stick up for them a little bit. They've actually done a better job with that kind of stuff the last few years. I mean, I go out there and I cover most games throughout the season. This is the first time in several years where I've said, this is ridiculous that you haven't called this game 3 hours 3 hours into a rain delay when the forecast didn't change from 3 o'clock on. They've actually done some good things this year from being a fan-friendly organization. The kids get in free thing. They've done some other promotions here and there that I've said, okay, that's a decent idea. But this was a major swing and a miss. There's no other way to excuse it. I heard some murmurings that Philadelphia wasn't being as cooperative as they would have liked as far as the Phillies not wanting to come back in and wanting to try to wait it out. But there was no window. I mean, there was nothing in that forecast at all that said that they were going to play. I mean, the best it got was at 1 a.m. it would drop down to, I think, a 50% chance of rain. So it was totally ridiculous. On the flip side, Wednesday, I mean, it was far from ideal, but I've seen teams all across baseball playing far, far worse than that. But Tuesday was just completely ridiculous, and I even had a couple personal friends of mine who actually went out of their way to try to attend Tuesday's game because they probably wanted to see the Phillies, one of the closer National League teams that the Orioles don't play all the time, and just ended up being a complete you-know-what.
Well, I know they're trying to get the game in because they don't come back. I mean, it's lucky they weren't playing, I don't know, the San Francisco Giants or whatever, right? Then they would never have an opportunity. But Philly's up the road, they'll make it up. But, making people sit out there on Tuesday night, making you sit out there, it's offensive to me. And what's really offensive beyond all of this, and I'll keep going back to this, who's running the place? Whose fault is it? Who makes that decision? Who's involved in this? And these are the answers we can't get for 25 years.
Well, who makes that call for any baseball team? I mean, when you're talking about a rain delay and who's canceling the game, that's
somebody has the keys to the building. At the end of the day, it's Major League Baseball's, it's the umpire, it's Buck's daddy, it's Uncle Brady, it's where's John, can we get Pete on the phone, where's Bob Ames? I don't know. I really don't know that when they walk in there, what was it, 10:15, and said, well, maybe we'll bang it tonight. whose desk does that land on? I don't know. I really don't.
I hear what you're saying. Do you know that for any team, though? That specific issue. I mean,
well, I should if I'm a ticket holder.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, we don't need to argue about this point. It was a complete disaster that they made people wait over 3 hours for that. Those are always collective decisions with any organization for a rainout. That's what I believe. Now, baseball operations and things of that nature, yeah, that's a completely different discussion. And then figuring out who's making the decisions about what, that's completely different. But I think deciding rain delays and rainouts and postponements and rescheduling games, I'm guessing that's a consensus, collective effort with a lot of teams.
Well, the Phillies are involved in it. You know, they have to want to come back or play a doubleheader, and then you looked at Wednesday's forecast, and you're like, well, we're going to be lucky to get the one game in that we got in, right? I mean, that's just where the weather was this week. But you have to have some sort of contingency besides sitting around till 10 o'clock at night trying to figure it out. That's
right, and that's why I said I defended them a little bit in the sense of there hadn't really been too many examples of that in recent years. I mean, I can tell you going back to, I've been covering games since 2010. I can remember that happening a few times in my first few years, and it seemed as though they had gotten a little bit better in that regard. And look, I mean, you can't just cancel a game based on a bad forecast all the time, or you'd have 15 games you'd have to make up come the last month of the season. So there's always going to be a certain amount of unknown and a certain amount of risk that you run when you buy tickets to a baseball game when you have an outdoor facility. And I mean, all the teams that don't have a retractable roof are in the same boat in that regard. But at the same time, common sense has to prevail at some point. If you wanted to wait to 7:30 or 8 o'clock, knock yourself out. I mean that's not atypical around baseball. But again, when you looked at that forecast at 3 p.m. and you looked at it at 4, and you looked at it at 5:30, and you kept going down the list.
Yeah, where was the window? I saw you tweet.
No window, right? I mean, there was just no conceivable way they were going to get that game in. The funny thing was that it didn't start raining until about an hour after the game was supposed to start. And I get it that teams now are using more radar to decide, if you should start a game, if it's going to start raining in 45 minutes, you don't want to lose your starting pitcher, all of that. I mean, you see that a lot around baseball, but the funny thing is, if they had actually bumped up the start to 5 o'clock, let's say, they would have gotten that game in. The funny thing, of course, the team's going to say, what? No, well, we can't do that to our fans, but then on the flip side, they'll make their fans wait for over 3 hours before they cancel the game. So that was a major swing and a miss. They've done some good things this year from a fan-friendly standpoint with kids getting in free and some other little things here and there, and their promotional schedule and all that. But when you have this happen, that's a major swing and a miss that kind of gets in the way. And I think kudos to them for Wednesday moving the game up half an hour. And I think when you saw what the rain was like in Baltimore once you got into the early evening, I think that was a smart move. But certainly they messed up big time on Tuesday night, and that definitely ticked off some fans in the process.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. The Birds off to Boston this weekend, and they did get a game in on Wednesday afternoon, and this is where we can discuss the Andrew Kashner experiment and just kind of where the team is at this point. I mean, we'll call it a successful homestand, right? I mean, better than Pivetta was okay, though, and beyond that, anyone with a curveball or some sort of a slider, this team's like Pedro Serrano. They're going to strike out 15 times.
Well, the funny thing is, this is a team that scored 58 runs over their previous 7 games. They actually have really started swinging the bats well on this homestand, but Pivetta was really good on Wednesday, and he's pitched pretty darn well for the Phillies this year. I mean, he has a 3.72 ERA. Most of that you can point to 1 or 2 starts where he really struggled. I think he had one outing where he gave up 6 runs in 1 inning. Kind of had a Dylan Bundy, a Chris Tillman kind of an outing. And I
call those Ubaldos, but that's okay.
But that really skewed his overall ERA. But he's pitched quite well for them, and that's they have the makings of a good starting rotation, especially when you throw Jake Arrieta into that mix. But Pivetta was really, really good. Struck out 11, matched his career high there. Had 23 swings and misses. And the one thing I had a chance to hear his post-game interview. The very first thing he talked about, taking advantage of the Orioles being a free-swinging offense. Their approach is not a secret around baseball whatsoever. They know that if you throw this team a lot of off-speed stuff, a lot of breaking stuff, and if you at least throw it to start on the edges of the strike zone, this team will expand then, and then you can throw the ball outside the strike zone, and they're not going to make the adjustment more often than not. So Pivetta was really good. You mentioned Cashner. Cashner wasn't bad. He ran into trouble in the sixth inning. He had a 1-0 lead he was staked to early and got nothing else after that. And the issue with him, and this isn't atypical, this is something that's pretty common for a lot of pitchers, but that third time through the order, going into Wednesday's game, third time through the order, teams have a 988 OPS against him, and on Wednesday, the Phillies got to him that third time through the order, 3 for 5, hit a home run, and drew a walk and chased him from the game. So, it happened pretty quickly for him. The final results still weren't that bad. I mean, 3 runs in 5 2/3 innings gives you a chance to win. It's not great, but that's kind of been one of the themes for him, who I think Cashner's been about what I expected he would be. I mean, he's got an ERA in the high 4s, but he's given this team a chance to win more often than not. That was kind of the expectation. I think everyone looked at his ERA, his peripherals last year, and figured he's probably not going to have an ERA in the low 3s again, but he's given them a chance. But the Orioles just couldn't do anything against Pivetta other than the Adam Jones home run, the second batter of the game. I mean, he was really, really good and only gave up 2 hits over 7 innings. And then we saw Gabe Kapler turn it into a bullpen game using, 4 different pitchers for the final 2 innings. Pretty interesting there.
The great baseball mind of Gabe Kapler has been discussed before, yes.
He's interesting. How about changing pitchers with 2 outs in the 9th inning and a 3-run lead? You don't see that too often.
I thought it was nice for Buck to get a preview of the team he'll be managing next year.
I don't know. I mean, give Gabe Kapler some credit. He got so much criticism for the opening week, and they struggled. They played really well since then. I mean, the Phillies are 8 games over 500 for the first time since the end of 2000.
And I haven't heard of any of their players, which makes it even crazier, right?
Well, I mean, they've got some good players. I mean, there are a few guys in that lineup. I mean, Odubel Herrera's he's been ascending for a couple years now. Rhys Hoskins went nuts last year. They added Carlos Santana in the offseason. Maikel Franco's been there for a few years. That's a team that has some good young players, and it's interesting to look at that division when you look at how bad the Phillies have been, how bad the Braves have been over the last few years.
How bad the Marlins still are?
Well, I mean, the Marlins are the Marlins, but the Phillies and the Braves, you look at those 2 teams, and you look at where Washington is now, and I still think the Nationals are going to be at the top of that division when it's all said and done. But the Braves and the Phillies are 2 teams that look like they are ascending and not going anywhere anytime soon. So the complexion of that NL East, where you have the Marlins bad, the Mets are mediocre and are so dependent on the health of their starting rotation to be any good at all. But the Braves and the Phillies are, we've seen them go through some down times here recently. And if you're an Orioles fan right now, those are teams you point to and hope. And I'm not saying that there is going to be a plan and there is going to be an effective rebuild, but those are 2 teams that were really bad for quite a while, and now they're good. But how are you making that happen?
Well, they draft players with dark skin and funny accents and and bad English is what they do.
Well, it's not drafting. You need to sign them. I mean, you need to find these players. I mean, the Orioles drafting has not been a colossal problem. It's that they've cut themselves off at the knee, and I know Baseball America touched on this with an article earlier in the week that this team hasn't spent a total of $1 million on international talent in the last 2 years combined.
About as much as Mr. Angelos has spent on Cadillacs, I think.
Well, I mean, it's just bad business. It's not. You want to rebuild your farm system. You want to have a good farm system, and this is akin to sitting out multiple rounds of the amateur draft. I mean, the international market is such a great pipeline of talent.
But they're foreign, Luke. Don't you understand? They're foreign. Don't you understand that?
Well,
you can't have them here. They're foreign.
I don't know how much of it's that compared to how much of it is thinking that investing $1 million in a 16-year-old or 17-year-old Dominican player is too great a risk, even though it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because on the flip side, you gave Ubaldo Jimenez $50 million, who certainly hadn't had the best track record.
Or Andrew Cashner's getting, 12, 14 million, whatever the number is this year, to start that in wins and losses that don't matter anymore. They've given money to all sorts of causes other than Miguel Gonzalez, I guess. It's really weird how cheap they are in certain ways, and how Chris Davis is going to be getting $130 million the next 15 years. None of it makes any sense from a comparing apples to oranges, I guess, right? And the way they spend their money. Right.
And the thing is, any select international talent, just like any draft pick, unless you're picking in the top 5, and heck, we've seen the Orioles pick in the top 5. Guys like Brian Mattis didn't work out.
They'll be picking in the top 5 next year, right?
Yeah, okay. It's looking that way. Sure. Right? Okay. Of course.
They'll get a blue chipper.
They'll be in play for the number 1 pick if they continue to play.
Brady Anderson will get somebody he can draft that he can invite over to the place like Nolan Reimold and screw them all up. So yeah.
But my point is, no single draft pick and no single international talent signing is going to be a sure thing. And in most cases, when you just look at the probability of any select draft pick or any select international signing, it's going to amount to little more than a lottery ticket. But the issue is the Orioles aren't buying nearly enough lottery tickets in that regard. You have to invest, and you have to understand that not every single one's going to work out. And that's just the reality. And to be very clear, you can be a player in the international market without giving out multiple million-dollar signing bonuses. You can do this in a way that you just sign more players and you just give them modest bonuses. $100,000 isn't something that's going to bankrupt your organization, but you give out some of those rather than only sign a handful of players.
Well, you also have to have the scouts to identify them, and they lack that as well.
Right, and that's the other issue as well. So, that's something that regardless of who's running the show moving forward, whether it's Brady Anderson or Buck Showalter, some combination of them, someone else that they bring in, they have to get ownership to change the philosophy here. We've talked a lot about the future with Peter. We've talked about John and Lou Angelos. Whoever is ultimately the face of ownership, baseball people have to convince them to understand how important it is to invest in the international market and how difficult it's going to be to rebuild this farm system if you're going to continue to be completely absent in that talent pool. You're just doing yourself a complete disservice, and then in turn, you're putting a lot of unfair expectations on your amateur scouting to try to have absolutely perfect drafts. You're not going to have a perfect draft. This would be like if the Ravens decided to say, well, we're no longer going to sign free agents. We're just going to build through the draft, and that's it. That would be crazy. And you know what? It would be next to impossible to really build the kind of roster that you need to have to continuously contend. You might have some periods where you hit on a few really good players, and that'll give you a competitive window. But if you want to sustain success, if you want to set yourself up for the long term, I don't know how you continue to look at the international market and say, no thanks, that's not for us. That's just such a bad way of trying to build an organization. It's absolute lunacy in that regard.
Well, those people have dark skin, they have funny accents, and they're foreign. So for that, treat them the way the president treats them at this point. Keep them out. So the Orioles will be in Boston this weekend, 4 games, and running between pitching at this. I don't know where all the innings are going to come from. I know this. The Red Sox are the better team at this point, competing for first place with the Yankees. The Orioles are 13-29, playing .310 ball right now and only being chased by the Chicago White Sox at this point. Any long-term play on at what point you think trades and at what point do you think we're going to be sending a WNST text of weird proportions here? I don't know if there could be any prediction on this, but we're getting up on Memorial Day now, and I guess we're 6 or 7 weeks out on the All-Star game now. At some point, some rumors, at some point some activity. They're a last-place team. They're not a competitor. I don't know where the movement will come, but I don't sense any rumors floating at this point. I don't sense that somebody's on the phone feverishly trying to do what Ozzie Newsome was doing for 2 months leading up to the draft, which is saying, if this, then that, if that, then this. Where's the conjecture on what's going to happen here this summer? Because there should be a lot of things that happen for the Orioles over the next 6-7 weeks.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, it begins and ends, at least in terms of players they're going to move with Manny Machado. I would think if there's going to be movement there, it's going to be probably starting in the month of June. I know that they've talked about Memorial Day. I mean, they should be listening to anything and everything at this point with really any player, just about. I mean, I think if you're going to rebuild, you're better off to go further into a rebuild than the alternative where you try to trade one or two guys and then try to think you're going to reload next year, and then the chase for 82 wins continues, and you're really not getting anywhere as an organization. But I mean, we continue to go back to who's exactly going to make this call, who's exactly going to make this decision. I mean, I can tell you this. I mean, throughout the homestand, I regularly saw Brady Anderson and Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter, and I even saw them talk to each other. So there's that. I don't want to interpret that as meaning anything more than what it is, but it does show you that Dan Duquette hasn't been sent home, so to speak. There hasn't been anything like that to this point. You can certainly debate who's making the calls, but there hasn't been anyone that has been exiled, so to speak. So I'm guessing you get into the month of June, and I think teams start to figure out more and more who they are. I mean, we were talking so much about the L.A. Dodgers after Seager went down, and the Dodgers are looking like a team that they might end up selling. They're 10 games below 500 now. So I think with the Orioles, you always assume later rather than sooner because that's just the way they operate, even things they've done correctly over the last 5 to 6 years, and they have, and they've had success, and
they're not a proactive bunch. I'll put it to you that way, right?
But they're typically not proactive, and they're typically very deliberate in anything they do. And that even goes back to Andy MacPhail. I mean, Andy MacPhail, for all the good things he did, was always very, very deliberate in how he acted. So I'm guessing later rather than sooner in that regard. But at the same time, every day you wait on Manny Machado, hypothetically speaking, the value goes down. Now, that doesn't take into account desperation of other teams, needs of other teams, the urgency of other teams. So that doesn't mean automatically that a deal on May 17th is definitely going to be better than a deal on June 1st. But at the same time, you continue to wait, and you wait, and you wait, and you get into mid to late July, then by that time, you are talking about a diminished return. So the big issue is you have to have someone to gauge all of this, to gauge other teams' needs, to gauge the sense of desperation, the sense of urgency that contenders are going to have, teams that are certainly going to be in the market for Manny Machado's services. And then, on top of that, what does that mean in terms of Zach Britton, who is now throwing live BP and could go on a rehab assignment on the next homestand and could be back by early June? What does that mean for Brad Brock, who is starting to look okay from a pitching standpoint, but they still need him to be pitching much better if they're going to get anything for him? Adam Jones has swung the bat well. We've talked about how complicated that is. So there's multiple things to be juggling at this point in time, but it still comes back to who's going to make that decision. And I don't expect the Orioles to just come right out and announce who's going to make that decision, because that's not the way they operate. But at the same time, someone does need to make that decision, and you hope that that's established, and you can be taking trade offers, and you can be taking calls, and you can be trying to move Manny Machado for the best possible deal and trying to maximize the return that you can get. But if you're going to ask me when I think that's going to happen, I'm guessing that's not happening before the month of June. So,
well, June 4th through the 6th is the draft, right? So that begins on that Monday.
Yeah.
They'll be drafting baseball players that week. Nobody's making deals that week.
Right. I mean, it would be a surprise to see a deal at that point in time. I think the soonest I would expect it would be shortly after the draft, and that's not anything I've heard. It's just conjecture and speculation at this point. But again, from if you're going to talk about the proverbial vacuum, the value for Manny Machado is higher now than it will be in early July. So you want to try to find that sweet spot to draw up enough interest, get teams bidding against themselves. We've talked about it. I don't care if it's a team that has a blatant need at third base or shortstop, or just a team that could stand to upgrade. Machado is that special of a talent that any team that's considers themselves a contender could use Machado, and you make it work, even if it's a rental. And that's not to say the Orioles are going to get a king's ransom, but I absolutely think they can get themselves a couple good prospects that can help them set up, to continue this rebuilding effort. But again, we go back to the question of who exactly is making the call, who exactly is evaluating these trade offers to ultimately make a decision, and that's where I have the least amount of confidence.
He is Luke at WNST.net, as well as Baltimore Luke on Twitter. The Orioles in Boston all weekend. We will be around the racetrack and, of course, in a hockey rink near you. All of it at WNST.net. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. We're in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear. The morning newspaper ships to your email inbox digitally each and every morning. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. We also have the Maryland Jockey Club entries for the weekend on the front of WNST.net, as well as in our morning newspaper. Any breaking news? Not expecting Manny Machado to be dealt, but if he is, you'll get it first on the WNST Text Service. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis will be here Thursday, this Thursday, next Thursday, every Thursday from 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.